very good to talk to you. Well, reports then of this strike on a NATO country. What are the priorities right now?
Well, the absolute top priority is to establish what actually happened. Because if we take, or anybody takes decisions on poor information, then we're bound to make poor decisions. So the really important thing is to gather information as to what actually happened. And then there needs to be a rapid assessment as to analysing what happened and why it happened. I think probably at this stage there are two major explanations. One, it was an error on the part of the Russians. That might be right, but it might not be right. Equally, the alternative explanation is that it's something of a test to see what NATO will do. As your correspondents have said, and the press conference which you were carrying earlier made quite clear, an attack on one NATO member is a breach of Article 5, and therefore it's an attack on all member states. But we want to make sure that we don't rush into a wider conflict as a result of a miscalculation or a mistake. So establishing what's happened is really important, and then cool heads need to analyse what our response should be. But at this stage, we should be very, very cautious.
Well, in terms of that NATO response, as you say, as we all know by now, this Article 5 of the treaty, that an attack on one NATO nation is an attack on them all. Before that, of course, is Article 4, which would call for emergency consultations. That perhaps is the route that Poland might initially follow.
Well, I would certainly hope so, because we all know that jaw is better than war. So the open channels and the back channels should be being worked vigorously at the present moment to try and find out not just what happened, but why it happened. Modern technology is pretty accurate, so it's quite difficult to explain away that this might have been an accident. If it wasn't an accident, then actually it was a test of the West's response. And that's something that's got to be thought through very, very carefully. And that's why I said just now, cool heads are required to make sure that this appalling war does not get escalated as a result of miscalculation or a quick decision on behalf of an aggrieved party.
But of course, Lord Dannatt, what is not in doubt yet again today is this wave of missile strikes by Russia on many, many targets, civilian targets in Ukraine, seen as thumbing their nose after the G20 summit, in which President Zelensky addressed that summit, referred to it as the G19, of course, saying that Russia really should be excluded. It clearly is almost, or is it already, a rogue state now?
Well, there's no doubt at all that the tough words spoken at the G20 have been met by probably almost a predictable response by Russia to continue its outrageous attack on Ukrainian civilian targets. We've seen it over the last 3, 4, 5 weeks that Vladimir Putin wants to destroy as much of the critical national infrastructure of Ukraine that he possibly can, particularly targeting their electricity capability, which of course then gets into water and all the rest of it, to make life as miserable as possible for Ukrainian people, because he has this rather naive thought that he could break the will of the Ukrainian people and they'll change their mind about the war. We have a Ukrainian couple living with us here in Norfolk. They're not going to have their minds changed by that. I don't think the people in Ukraine will. So it's a very naive thought that he's got. But it's a pathetic reaction to the tough words spoken at the G20, that once again the Russians launch a myriad of missiles at Ukrainian targets. And then, of course, for good measure, there's this swipe at Poland. And, of course, this is a classic Putin tactic. And over the last 5, 10 years, he's posed various questions of the West. That big cyber attack on Estonia, the intervention in Syria, and various other events that he's engineered. He just wants to know what our response is going to be, because what he really, really wants is to get a fracture within the unanimity of NATO and the West. That's what he hopes for most, to try and get the West to fracture and for us to start disagreeing amongst ourselves. And that's why this attack in Poland, we absolutely need to know the information. We need to be very clear in our analysis, very cool-headed about it, and then decide what the right thing to do is. And as things currently stand, probably to accept a rather lame excuse from the Russians, if offered, that actually it was a mistake. But we don't want to rush into a wider war as a result of a miscalculation.
But would the Russians even go that far? We know their form on that. They'll claim it's a false flag. The Ukrainians did it, or the Poles did it, or NATO did it. But if NATO does establish that this was Putin testing the waters, testing the border, what should the response be to show that NATO will not crumble?
Well, we need to see what the Russian response is. Remember the near miss of the Rivet joint aircraft, which the Russians said was a mistake. Well, we, the UK, accepted that as a reasonable explanation because, as I said just now, we don't want to get into a wider war as a result of miscalculation. You mentioned Article 4. Article 4 is absolutely right, that all the channels of communication should be opened for Poland to actually say to the Russians, what is going on here? And it's really important that there is as much discussion and understanding and negotiation as possible. Because if we take the alternative explanation that this was a deliberate attack on Poland, then it puts us into Article 5 territory. And that is a very dangerous place to be, because it then poses the question to NATO, what are you going to do? I don't think we want to be there. We want to be very, very cautious and just watch this situation very clearly, understand what actually has happened, but be pretty cautious. Being cautious doesn't mean to say we're going to be weak, but what we don't need to be is to be rash and escalate unnecessarily.